My name is Ralph Story. On September 1st, 1939, the curtain was raised on what was to become the most spectacular event in the history of mankind. World War II started with the sudden attack on Poland by Hitler's Nazi Germany. The use of screaming Stuka dive bombers ushered in a new era of aerial warfare. Before World War II ended, 6 years later, 57 nations had become involved. Over 100 million men and women served in the armed forces of their respective countries, and millions of military personnel and civilians alike lost their lives. You now have a front row seat to the revealing story of how air power was used to defeat the enemy without the necessity for a land invasion. This is the true story, as told in first-person accounts by the military commanders who had been assigned the responsibility of developing and executing the bold strategies and daring tactics needed to bring about a decisive victory. Their leadership and skill was instrumental in the defeat of both Germany and Japan, a victory that brought an end to World War II. The monumental wartime decisions that the military and political leaders made changed the course of history.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification.
Now, let's go back in time to the balmy days of early winter in beautiful Hawaii. The year is 1941.
Shipmates, today is the third Sunday of Advent, the 7th of December, which means that Christmas is not far ahead.
A grim prediction is about to come true. A World War I fighter pilot and visionary air leader, General Billy Mitchell, was an often outspoken advocate on America's military preparedness, and he stressed the importance of the development and use of air power. Many of his viewpoints, often controversial, later proved to be correct. Regrettably, nobody was paying any attention to him at the time, because much earlier he had made a prophetic warning that on some quiet, peaceful Sunday morning, while Americans still slept, the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor from the air.
Man your battle stations. God bless you.
December 7th, 1941, one of the most tragic and unforgettable days in history. Pearl Harbor, the island of Oahu, shortly after 8 o'clock Sunday morning, Hawaiian time. Without warning, the Japanese launch a massive series of air attacks from their nearby aircraft carriers. The United States Naval Fleet and mainland operations are hard hit. A catastrophic and near mortal blow on all the American forces has been struck, and the result is chaos, destruction, and death. When the carnage of this tragic day is over, the grim toll of American casualties will be enormous. In the capsized battleship Arizona alone, 1,178 men have gone to their deaths. Their bodies will lie entombed in the ship as a permanent memorial. Many military facilities and airplanes have received shattering blows everywhere, and the defenses are helpless and ineffective against the Japanese surprise attacks. The American nation and its people are in complete shock and confusion. December 7, 1941, a day of infamy, will remain indelibly etched in the minds and hearts of all Americans. This day will change the lives of millions of people throughout the world forever. A great statesman once said, "There's no such thing as a good war." And General Curtis E. LeMay would certainly agree with that philosophy. During his illustrious and exciting career as a military leader and a commander, he was called upon to take part in developing the strategy and tactics necessary to defeat Japan and bring an end to the most devastating war ever fought. Early in his career, General LeMay's talents for planning and ingenuity brought him to the attention of his superiors, who recognized his natural leadership abilities. From his assignment as commander of an 8th Air Force bomb group in England, General LeMay eventually rose to the highest rank attainable in the United States Air Force, Chief of Staff. Why didn't anybody listen to Billy Mitchell?
He was considered something of an upstart, and a maverick in the Army at the time. And he, I think, deliberately carried things far enough to receive a court-martial, to bring his case before the public. I think now that he has been generally recognized as being right all along, but unfortunately he's not alive to receive the plaudits he should have had then.
Well, what happened there on December 7th, 1941 should have proved to everybody that we should have a big, immediate Air Force, but the Air Force was still a small part of the Army. It was the Army Air Corps.
That's true. Before the build-up started, which was shortly before we actually got into the war, we had in the Army Air Corps about 1,200 officers, regular officers and reserve officers on active duty, and about 10,000 men. This force was expanded to 2.5 million, nearly 2.5 million. So you can see the tremendous job we had of scattering these few people around such a large force, of training the people, building the force, training them, putting it into combat. It was a tremendous job.
The shock and anger over the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor sent waves of patriotism and determination throughout America. It resulted in a mighty force of men and women who went into the armed forces anxious to do their part for the war effort. Both men and women from all walks of life joined the workforce at American defense plants to do their part to manufacture the equipment and supplies needed to supply their fighting forces. Their efforts produced ships, planes, tanks, and other essential materials of such superior quality and in such vast numbers, it resulted in a modern production miracle. A highly regarded young Army Air Corps officer by the name of Haywood Hansel was a top planner prior to and during World War II.
We got started in the planning business when the President wrote a letter to the Secretary of War and Secretary of Navy. He wrote in this letter a request for the requirements in production to defeat our potential enemies. It was a very significant letter, and the most significant part of it was that word defeat. He didn't ask what it would take to defend ourselves. He asked what it would take to defeat our enemies, a very important difference. Now, the air power that existed in concept at that time stemmed pretty much from Billy Mitchell's statement that airplanes made it possible to overfly struggling armies on the ground and go initially to the basic interior structure of an enemy nation and bring about its collapse. On this general approach, we determined the number of bombs required to destroy the targets, the number of aircraft that would be necessary to deliver those bombs, time involved. When it added all up, it was a pretty staggering figure. We presented it to the General Staff, with General Marshall present, and the General Staff took vigorous exception to it. To man that force was going to require 2,140,000 people, which was a 42-fold increase in the Air Force. Not 42%, 4,200%. General Marshall held his peace, made no comment at all until the discussion had finally died down. And he said, gentlemen, I think the plan has merit. It was the moment of conception of the United States Air Force.
Before the war, Americans had a somewhat misleading idea of Japan and the Japanese. Japan was thought of as a picturesque little country filled with cherry blossoms and dotted with beautiful temples and ornate Shinto shrines. The Japanese people, it was understood, were exceptionally well-mannered. They made a fetish of politeness. Practically all of their houses, we thought, were made out of bamboo and rice paper. Japan, through centuries of isolation from the rest of the world, was little known to us, and America underestimated her ability to build a modern war machine. Bamboo and rice paper? The fact was, parts of her cities were more strongly built than our own. Periodically visited by earthquakes, the Japanese had investigated and put to use every modern scientific method of building shock-proof structures. Japanese industry became westernized after the First World War. She learned how to mass produce. She not only mass produced cotton and silk, toys and machinery, but guns and tanks and planes, until over half of her entire industrial output was devoted to war production only. This, then, was Japan at war, a modern nation with a powerful and efficient war machine. The unorthodox fighting tactics and the culture of the enemy created situations that were completely at odds with the historic training traditions of United States Armed Forces. And this was also to be the proving grounds for one of the finest and most effective long-range military bombers ever designed, the B29 Superfortress. The original conception of the advanced new bomber needed for the future was a high-altitude airplane that would carry tremendous loads for great distances, non-stop, without refueling, and defend itself with its own firepower. During the late 30s, the foresight of General Hap Arnold and the Army Air Force planners succeeded in putting in motion the plans for developing the most advanced and efficient new bomber in the world, the new B29 Superfortress.
The B29 was put into production before they ever flew a prototype.
You mean they never tested it?
Consequently, no testing at all. We tested it as we flew it in combat. So this required, in addition to the normal maintenance you have in a new airplane, all of the modifications that had to be made to the design to sort of really do its job. So that took time away from the combat hours that you really want to use it for. In addition to that, you had crews that were not trained on the airplane because it came out of the factory just before they came overseas with it. So you had to apply some time to train these crews. And the first position for combat was in Western China, with bases in India and advanced bases up in China.
Japan's early long-range plans for the conquest and domination of the Far East proved to be an effective advantage for them and an incredible problem for the Allies. It denied the Allies access to territories where forward bases could be built. Pressure was mounting to launch effective air strikes against Japan. This pressure contributed to the decision to establish a B-29 operation on the mainland of China. The heads of the Allied powers reached an agreement with General Chiang Kai-shek to build airstrips in China for the new B-29 Superforts now coming off the production lines in the United States. But construction of the bases was a nightmare. The runways were built with no heavy equipment, no bulldozers, trucks, or cranes. The Chinese built the airstrips as they had built roads for centuries by hand. Thousands of peasant laborers, young and old, were needed to lay a rock mosaic inch by inch for over a mile. The most primitive construction methods were used to enable the world's most advanced weapon of war to fulfill its mission by defeating the enemy with air power. General Kenneth B. Wolfe, the highly regarded project commander responsible for the development of the B-29, was placed in command of the first B-29s assigned to China. The few combat missions flown under General Wolfe demonstrated that the supply problems would be insurmountable. In late August of 1944, Major General Curtis E. LeMay, an experienced combat leader, noted for his hard-nosed, daring, and innovative tactics, was placed in command of the B-29 bomber operations in China. But the logistical nightmare continued. All supplies to support the operation, including gasoline and bombs, had to be flown in over the treacherous Himalayas by available transport planes and bombers.
It was a completely futile operation except for its political purpose. The airplanes were coming off the line. They had to go somewhere. We didn't have any bases that would permit us to attack Japan except China. The Marianas were not yet captured, although they were to be captured for the purpose of basing B-29s there.
You were sort of going into Japan by the back door through India and Burma.
Much so, very much so. It was a political motivation, really, a military political motivation. If those B-29s were sent to MacArthur, as he was screaming for them, we'd never have gotten them back. If they went to MacArthur, they'd have to go to Nimitz. If they went to Nimitz, we'd never get them back either. So the whole concept of a strategic air war against Japan, with the same general purpose that we had in view to start with, to cause the defeat of a modern nation without an invasion. This was our purpose. It would never have been possible to achieve it if we had diverted those forces to those theater commanders.
As the history of World War II unfolded, it became painfully evident that changes would have to be made in traditional military command structures. The military leaders agreed that the B-29 operations in the Pacific would be of such critical importance that they should be placed directly under the control of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, General Hap Arnold commanding. At the beginning of the war, the Allies had agreed to concentrate their efforts toward fighting the war in Europe and defeating Germany while maintaining a holding action against the Japanese in the Pacific. Now, with the European conflict having reached the point where the Allies were confident that victory over Germany was certain, they agreed to commit more personnel and equipment to the war in the Pacific. In August of 1943, at a meeting in Quebec, Canada, Allied leaders and their combined chiefs of staff made the decision that the American B-29 bombers met all the specifications necessary to carry the war direct to the mainland of Japan. Once that decision was made, the B-29s were given a top priority production classification. This resulted in an accelerated all-out effort to get the plane into mass production and then deliver them to the training units. The final phase of World War II had its beginning in the heartland of America. An elite group of America's finest young aviators was selected and sent to bases located principally in Nebraska and Kansas. This group included hand-picked battle-wise combat veterans, West Pointers, and graduates of Army Air Force flying and technical schools. America's hopes of ending the war with Japan now was tied to the success of the B-29 Superfort and its crews of courageous young airmen. They were being called on to complete a difficult mission, defeat a stubborn and fanatical enemy. The new crews were not only training for combat, they were also being required to flight test the new plane, report on malfunctions, and identify modifications necessary to make it combat ready. America was well into the third year of war before sufficient numbers of the new B-29s with trained crews were available to be transferred to bases now available in the Marianas. It was 5 in the morning, and they were on their way. The chaplain gave each of the crews a St. Christopher medal. Christopher is the patron saint of travelers, he explained before he blessed them. And if there's one thing you boys are going to do, it's travel. This was the takeoff for one of the greatest mass flights in history. First lap from Grand Island, 1,321 miles westward to Mather Field, California. Mather Field was their POAE, Point of Aerial Embarkation. Here, the crews had to go through a final inspection line checkup. Then they were ready for the second lap, from Mather Field to Pearl Harbor, 2,415 miles farther west. On this first overwater hop, it was the navigators who were on the spot. With all their fancy equipment, their minds still had to make the final calculations. An error of 2 degrees would wind their ship up over nothing but ocean with empty gas tanks. Diamond Head, right on the nose. Good old navigator. The crews relaxed. Now they began to think about hula girls and the beach at Waikiki. At Pearl Harbor, however, they found themselves restricted to the airfield. The only hula girls they saw were painted on the doors of the PX, for something much bigger was in the making. In an office on that same field, a new bomber command was being born. The 21st, Brigadier General Haywood Hansel commanding. Now, among this group of born leaders was a young man whose claim to fame, among other accomplishments, was piloting the first B-29 into that Pacific theater. Arriving as a major, he rapidly advanced through the ranks and was destined to have a brilliant future in the Air Force. He retired a 4-star general, General Jack Catton. I'd like to take away that rank for a minute and bring you back to Major in that first flight out into the Pacific Theater. You remember it?
I do. I'll never forget it, and I'll go along with that point. We flew to Mather in California, Mather Field here in California, near Sacramento, and flew from there out to Hickam, Honolulu, Hawaii, from there to Kwajalein, and from Kwajalein out to Saipan in the Marianas.
You remember the arrival in Saipan?
I'll never forget it. It was one of the big thrills of my life. We'd had kind of an interesting experience in Kwajalein. Kwajalein, as you know, is a very small island. It had a 5,000-foot coral strip that they'd fought for and gotten for us. They were operating B-24s out of there, but the interesting point was that nobody had seen a B-29. None of those people had seen a B-29. The airplane was still classified. So when we landed there, of course, the military police secured the area, put a rope around the airplane, and kept people away from it. And the next morning, when we came out to take off to head out to Saipan, there was a big sign in front of my airplane with an arrow pointing to an airplane in an adjacent parking place, which was a B-24. And the sign read, "This is a B-24, a proven combat airplane. Visitors are welcome." But when we left Kwajalein for the last leg of our flight, as we approached Saipan, we were met by a group of American fighters, P-47s that were on East Field in Saipan, and they were the first airplanes into the island after it had been secured. And those great guys and those jugs came out and, you know, got on either side of the airplane and a formation of a V in front of us and took us on over the island so we could fly by and have everybody take a look. And then we did a 9270, came back in and landed. And as we approached the runway, you could see literally, and this is hard to believe, but there were thousands of Marines and Army personnel lining the runway on either side of the runway, literally thousands of people. And it really impressed us with our importance and our responsibility, because a great deal of human suffering was encountered in taking these islands, which were so important to our oncoming strategy. And we realized that we had to do our job and do it very well.
The first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
When I got to the Marianas, I was aghast because so far from having a finished base, we had almost nothing. Of the two bases, one of them was useless. The other one had one runway, 8,500 feet long, but only 7,000 feet of it was paved, and about 40 hard stands instead of 80. We hadn't been there but a short time when the Japanese fleet forayed into the Philippine Sea and caused a tremendous amount of disturbance in the Navy command. They didn't know where the Japanese fleet was or what to do. I had about 40 B29s, not enough to launch an attack against Tokyo, but I was very uncomfortable sitting there with that much force without doing anything. I was very much afraid that Admiral Nimitz would take advantage of the emergency clause. There was an emergency clause in the Joint Chiefs of Staff command arrangements, which said that a theater commander can take command of the B-29s at any time that he feels that it is a major emergency and notify the Joint Chiefs of Staff to that effect.
So now perhaps you've set the scene for Hap Arnold's insistence that in the Pacific things were going to be different, weren't they?
This was the great lesson that General Arnold learned from his experience in Europe. Do not permit the strategic air forces to be diverted to tactical purposes.
With American forces having retaken the Marianas, this put the B-29 forces within striking distance of Japan for the first time. After 6 months of liberation, the once peaceful and romantic island of Guam began to take on the signs of earlier days. However, the natives returning to their villages found themselves now sharing their tropical paradise with another group of Americans who were there to preside over the final phase of World War II. The American service personnel stationed on the tropical islands in the Pacific had to resort to their tremendous versatility, ingenuity, and resourcefulness to supply the necessities of life for their home away from home. The 21st Bomber Command was ready to hit its first target.
Our target for today is one of 3 of the Nakajima aircraft plants located 11 miles west of Tokyo.
The men had hoped the first one would be Tokyo, and they were delighted. But they weren't kidding themselves, not even those who'd been over Berlin or Ploesti or Vienna. London to Berlin and back was 1,000 miles. But Saipan to Tokyo and back was over 3,000 miles. Crew chiefs and maintenance men worked right through the afternoon and night. The ordnance men fused the payload. dawn. The coolness reminded them of that other dawn not so long ago in Nebraska, only now they were sweating. Each Superfort carried well over 7,000 gallons of gas, more than 6,000 rounds of ammunition. With their great load of 500-pound general-purpose bombs and incendiaries, they weighed almost 70 tons apiece. This was the final lap of the long mission. Over 10,000 miles, almost halfway around the world, to return a visit that had been paid to Pearl Harbor 3 years before. Pearl Harbor was on their minds now, the 2,000 American dead, Hickam Field in flames, the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the Pennsylvania. And there were other things on their minds. There was the triumphant feeling of being the first. The advance guard of a long procession of superforts that would smash Tokyo. There was the grim satisfaction of making the enemy eat its words. Tokyo, the Japanese high command had broadcast, is out of range of land-based American bombers. And there was the uncertainty, the fear of the unknown. 1,600 miles lay between them and the target. What kind of defense would be put up? How much flak? How accurate? 1,600 miles lay between the target and getting back to Saipan. How many of them would get back? Six hours later, through the clouds, they saw it. Fujiyama, ancient symbol of Japan. But here come some modern symbols, phosphorus bombs, and flak, and fighters. Inside a Superfort, you can't see its guns. You fire by remote control. But the guns are there. Now, below them is Tokyo. Within a radius of 15 miles of the Imperial Palace live 7 million Japanese. But it isn't imperial palaces these men are looking for. In the suburbs of Tokyo is the huge Nakajima aircraft plant.
No part of the Japanese Empire is now out of our range. No war factory too remote to feel our bombs. The battle for Japan is now underway with full speed ahead.
In a time of war, every day has its triumphs and its tragedies, but sometimes there are discoveries too. And one day, the B-29s out in the Pacific fighting the war against Japan discovered something, a phenomenon, and a brand new word was added to our language, jet stream. How did you discover the jet stream?
Well, it was our first mission against Japan, and our target was Tokyo. And after we had flown formation and punched two fronts and got to the climb point, which is just south of the island, we started our climb, climbing to 35,000 feet, a very high altitude for 1944. And as we were climbing, I kept getting corrections from my navigator. 5 degrees left, please. 7 degrees left, please. 10 degrees left, please. And for a pilot who's done a lot of flying, you know, either that navigator's lost his mind or something very strange is occurring.
You're flying in like a crab.
Yeah, we're flying
Sideways.
in just exactly like a crab, and actually our initial point, the place where we start our bomb run, was Mount Fuji. And Mount Fuji was sitting up very majestically and very clearly above the clouds, and we could see it from a long way out. And as we were climbing, there was Fuji, and I kept going like this and like this and like this. We had about a 35-degree correction in, and we were drifting that far to get to Fuji. And we had no idea that the winds at those altitudes would be so extreme. And what we were encountering was a jet stream with speeds of up to 110, 115 knots. Made it very difficult for us.
General J.B. Montgomery, known as Monty to a lot of the people in the Air Force, was the Deputy Chief Operations of the 20th Air Force. General, maybe I should first ask you what the Operations Officer of the 20th Air Force does. I mean, what is an Ops Officer?
The Ops Officer is responsible for combining your attack forces into the target system. So he has to know what the objectives are. He has to know what your force is capable of doing, and therefore he is able to plan the missions and then to put out the field orders to the people who are going to execute them. And then after that mission is carried out, he is responsible for what we call the mission critique, where we bring the people who led the elements in there and analyze it and have them give their opinions as to the efficiency of the planning and what could be done to improve the mission.
So you're not only the planning officer, but you had to review it afterwards.
Review it afterwards. And he also, as being the operations chief, has to be responsible for gathering the target information, which put the photographic reconnaissance under him, and for running the weather recon airplanes into the Japanese area to find out enough information so that the forecaster, we call them the wind guessers, could give us a forecast of what the target was going to be weather-wise when we got there.
As the commander of the B-29 forces in the Pacific, General Curtis E. LeMay was a tough, no-nonsense combat leader who had developed a reputation for his innovative and creative tactics in planning the airstrikes against the mainland of Japan. Under his command, many nagging problems were solved. Among them, procuring the huge amount of supplies needed to support the massive operations, both by going through normal supply channels and sometimes by going around them. A major change implemented at the Marianas bases was the introduction of a centralized maintenance system to modify and repair all B-29s. This system proved so effective that the amount of time each plane could fly combat missions was substantially increased. General Curtis LeMay, working with his Navy counterparts, organized an effective air-sea rescue network using ships, submarines, and planes to rescue flyers forced to bail out or ditch in the Pacific. It extended from the shores of Japan to Iwo Jima. The operation proved so successful, it was credited with saving the lives of over 600 flyers.
It was a naval war, according to almost all the historians. Didn't you feel like an underdog going out to the Pacific in the Air Force?
Well, in some respects, yes. We were supposedly to be supplied by the Navy, but there are many cases where we felt they could have done a little better for us. For instance, when Tommy Powell arrived at his wing on Guam, the Navy supposed to prepare the facilities for it. And all that was there was a strip of coral down through the jungle, which the crews slept on the first night. But by and large, the Navy pick and shovel people helped us when they could. The Seabees got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, for instance, and hauled bombs for us from the ships to the hard stands. We skipped the bomb dumps. The Marines did likewise for us. So we got along.
The scene is the 21st Bomber Command on the island of Guam. The time is April 1945, and here's General Catton to tell us what's happening. Which one is you?
Well, this is Jim Seaver. He's a colonel, and he is briefing weather to General LeMay and his operational staff, along with intelligence, so the general can make the proper decision on what priority targets will be hit based on the best weather situation.
How did he know what the weather was going to be?
Well, there were very few ways to determine what the weather was going to be. The way we had to do it was to constantly run B-29 weather reconnaissance airplanes up and around where the weather generated so that they could provide information to Jim so he could make the forecast for the boss, General LeMay.
And General LeMay, chewing his cigar, in charge of this briefing. Now, what is accomplished here?
Well, what's happening here is we've already briefed on the missions that are available to him, the targets, then the weight of force that we intend to use. The details of the mission are briefed to the general. He takes a look at the weather, and he decides how the force will be applied in the next strike.
This is a planning session for tomorrow's mission.
It's a decision session,
And the decision is over?
He has made his decision, and as I recall this scene, I was to fly this mission because we were going to fly a new tactic we are going to employ to assemble our formations much closer to the targets.
Why?
So, well, when you fly 6 hours of formation from your takeoff point to landfall, it's a very tiring process, and it's a very heavy use of fuel, which was very precious to us.
Lieutenant Colonel Catton's combat experience helps the planning staff iron out operational kinks. Takeoff time is flashed to the controller, who coordinates the vast network of communications gathered here at the heart and nerve center of command. A timetable of statistics for each wing, as planned and flown, is recorded from hourly reports on the status panel, beginning with takeoff time. To veteran crews, it's just another day's work. One more 1,500-mile haul up and down the ruddy Pacific. 15 hours, 7,000 gallons, 4 engines, 11 guys. At Tinian, 100 miles north, 2 more B-29 wings prepare for takeoff. 134 aircraft from the 58th wing. 100 more from the 313th wing. At Saipan, a few minutes later, the veteran 73rd Wing lines up for takeoff. 153 more bombers are added to the mission's striking force. Those B-29 takeoffs are a tough sweat. That first long moment is the worst. Some say it takes luck, like a wife's stocking, to beat it. The navigator sets the course, logging island checkpoints as they climb past the northern Marianas. Flying at low altitude, the B-29s are approaching the bad weather belt, where unreported storms and cold fronts appear suddenly across the bomber course.
Pilot to crew, we're going to start our climb. Check oxygen equipment. Tell Buck he better get out to his doghouse.
As they begin their slow climb to altitude, the crews prepare for the vital business ahead. And from now on, until they come off target and head home, it's all business. The central fire control system is warmed up. Superhuman brain power at the flick of a switch. Each gunner flexes his sights and tries the coordinated fire controls with a few short bursts to clear the guns. After pushing up to altitude, the bombers arrive close to assembly point. Air in the pressurized cabin is comparable to 8,000 feet, but oxygen masks are adjusted and ready for instant use. Lead bombers begin to circle, dropping their new smoke markers for assembly. Lieutenant Colonel Catton observes this part of the tactical plan of action. From various zone positions, the groups form on their lead ships in 9 or 11 plane waves, which head for initial point. The big parade is on. Landfall is picked up, along with the first flak from enemy coastal batteries. Fujiyama, the familiar white beacon, marks the turn for initial point. Flak becomes heavier and more accurate. And now the first enemy planes appear, diving head-on into the formations. Some are suicide fighters trying to ram our bombers. Other fighters drop phosphorus bombs set to explode in front of the oncoming B-29s. From the turn at initial point, the tight bomber waves move steadily on and get ready for business. Flak and fighters fall off, but those clouds are beginning to move in, and it looks worse ahead. Then, just east of Hachioji, the Tokyo area breaks clear. The bombardiers begin to draw a bead on the target. The planes sit tight for the bombing run. The first waves of B-29s have already found their objective. Succeeding bomber groups add their devastation to the smoking targets. The tactical plan is now an accomplished fact. The bombers turn and go downwind. across the bay, and a tailwind speeds them south down the Cheepaw Peninsula. Many hours later, the bomber wings are nearing their bases. Exhausted crews wait out the last endless hour when the time seems to stop. Their position is radioed in, and the controller gets word of the approaching flight. At last, the familiar Marianas appear on the horizon. The bombers fly across Guam and turn into the landing pattern. It's good to feel the sudden humid heat, to be among the living, swapping stories with the ground crew. But some of those B-29 crews won't be able to talk it over today. 11 men and a bomber that didn't quite make it. The rescue squads tear away the hot metal. Somehow, in that burning wreckage, a man has lived to feel those gallant, eager hands. 1 life saved and 10 lost. That's part of today's toll. And there were many other days and nights that took their toll of young American lives. When those first B-29 crews arrived in the Pacific, they had a lot of enemies, more than just the Japanese. There was a long supply line all the way back home across the Pacific. There were the green crews and the untried airplane and the unknown weather. But perhaps the most important enemy was the Pacific Ocean itself. What did you have in between the Marianas and Tokyo?
Well, we had some enemies. The Japanese, who were involved in the island chain on up the look. For example, Iwo Jima, which became a very important place for us. For example, let me show you, Ralph, that these distances are really substantial. From the Marianas, for example, to Tokyo is some 1,600 nautical miles. So you're looking at a 3,200-mile flight, a mission that's going to take you on the order of 14 to 16 hours, depending on circumstances. And when we started our missions in the early or the latter part of 1944, we didn't have any rescue, very, very little.
And you didn't have Iwo Jima.
And we didn't have Iwo Jima. We had to avoid Iwo Jima because there's a substantial garrison of Japanese troops there. And they had flak and they had fighters, you know. So, yeah, we avoided Iwo Jima and Chichi-Jima Island up here. So the problems really were a tremendously long flight over a very hostile ocean. And if, in fact, we did have difficulty over the targets, and we frequently did get battle damage, we had 1,600 miles to get home. And that's a long, long way.
The savage battle waged for Iwo Jima was one of the most costly and lives lost in American history. It became obvious to the leaders of the Allied forces that the closer the battles got to the Japanese mainland, the more fierce the resistance became.